You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
Thanks to Concordia University, Wisconsin for your support of The Coffee Hour. You can find out more about Concordia University, Wisconsin at cuw.edu.
Live uncommon.
We get to dig into some of our LCMS history today, meet one of the historical figures that his last name is possibly familiar to you, hopefully familiar, depending on what kind of Lutheran circles you run in. But this person is very integral to our LCMS history. And we actually have him on our church calendar on May 4th. We commemorate him on May 4th. So we get to talk about Friedrich Wyneken today with Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, the Forrest E. and Francis H. Ellis Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. MacKenzie.
I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So we get to dig into the life of Friedrich Wyneken, and I know you know so much about his life, and I'm not sure we might just scratch the surface of this in 25 minutes, but that's okay. What do we know about the early years of Friedrich Wyneken?
Well, like most of the founders of the Missouri Synod, he was born in Germany, but of course there really wasn't a Germany then. He was born in that part of Germany which is called Hanover, and his father was a pastor, but his father also died when Friedrich was just 5 years old. But his mother managed to put her boys through university, and Friedrich, along with a couple of his brothers, became a pastor. And in those days, after you graduated from the university and were going into the ministry, you didn't go right away. You usually did something else. And in his case, he taught. He taught at Latin school. He also tutored. And during that time, he got interested in missions. In the 1830s, Germans were starting to leave Germany and go to other places, including North America. And mission societies were organizing to try to provide pastors for those people. And Wyneken got interested in that. Some other members of his family did as well. And so he decided that he instead of taking up post in Germany, he would go to the mission field and go to North America to help serve the German immigrants to our country.
So what did that journey to America look like?
Well, it would have been a sailing vessel. And though, most boats arrived, they didn't always arrive safely. At about the same time, Wyneken came in 1838, and that was just a few months prior to the Saxons coming as well. And there, if I remember correctly, it's like they had 4 boats and one of them sank. So it was not a sure thing. But apparently Friedrich's was uneventful, although he was using a vessel that later on was the same vessel that brought over Kramer. And Kramer was another one of those early missionaries and founders of the Missouri Synod.
So what would that journey have been like? What would his journey look like on this boat? Where did he actually end up in America?
He arrived safely in Baltimore, which was one of the port cities to which these vessels sometimes came. And Baltimore, of course, was a pre-Civil War city, a lot going on, and they actually had some German immigrants. And so Wyneken, as soon as he could, found Lutheran congregations, and there were a couple of them. The first one that he found was, the preaching there was kind of rationalistic, and it wasn't anything that attracted him. But he found what was called the Second Lutheran congregation. And there the pastor was a Pastor Hespert, and Hespert was an evangelical type who was interested in reaching the unreached with the gospel and organizing German Lutherans. and he became ill, and so for a couple of months, Wyneken was his substitute. But
Hmm.
Wyneken had come to do missions, and so Hespert put him in touch with today we'd probably call it a mission board. And this was something associated with the first of the um, Lutheran synods in North America. That was the Pennsylvania Ministerium. And they did send out missionaries into what was then the West. Today we think of it as the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. And so they were willing to do that. So he arrived spring, early summer, and by the fall, he was on his way out to Ohio and Indiana.
And so how was he used in his early years in America? How did
Okay.
God use him to serve the church?
Yeah, okay. Well, what he was concerned about originally was those German immigrants who were coming to America basically for economic reasons, not religious reasons. For example, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, it was um, a kind of he owned a mill and he was kind of a businessman, but he was concerned that there would be workers available to dig canals, and so he recruited Germans to come, uh, and that's why they came to dig canals, make a living, and so forth. And Germany didn't have the greatest economic opportunities in the 19th century. So, from about the 1830s up until about 1890, just lots of Germans came to America. So, what Wyneken saw as his task was locating where these Germans were and preaching, teaching, but especially trying to organize them into congregations. And so that's what he did. He arrived in Indiana, where a couple of churches had been founded, one here in Fort Wayne and one a few miles out of Fort Wayne. Um, but the pastor had died just shortly before Wyneken showed up. And so these congregations asked Wyneken to be their pastor. And he said, well, okay, but I still am going to be going around and trying to organize Germans into congregations. So he spent lots of time on the road, and maybe road isn't even the right term for what they were traveling on. And he'd go into an area and he would try to find out whether there were any Germans. And then if he located the Germans, he'd try to find out if they were interested in church. And not all of them were. Some were, but not all of them were. And this really concerned him that you had people from the motherland who were no longer interested in being Christian. So if they were interested, he would try to baptize babies, and he talks about having to baptize children who were like 10, 12 years old because there'd been no pastor and they'd not been baptized. And then he tried to do a little basic instruction, if he could, organize them into a congregation. And in that, he was remarkably successful. In fact, I'll give you a little factoid here. There were 14 congregations that joined the Missouri Synod in 1847. 6 of those were congregations that Wyneken had helped to organize.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's the kind of work that he was doing in all kinds of just very difficult and terrible conditions.
Hmm. Talk a little bit about those conditions during that time period. I'm sure there was some social things going on, some economic things. Being in a new country without a lot of support. Talk a little bit about those conditions he was working in.
Yeah, he talks about finding some German settlers and describes their life. They work every day, including Sundays, from morn until dusk, simply to grow enough food in order to feed themselves and their families. I mean, it was very forested land, so they had to clear the land of trees. Then they had to plant the crops, and those crops are subject to problems with the weather and all kinds of crop diseases. So this was a very poor, difficult life. And so Wyneken often found that they really didn't even have time or energy for church and religion. So that was one of the things he had to try to do, was to encourage them to think about their spiritual well-being as well as their physical well-being. And he wrote up many accounts of the kind of situation that he discovered. Another problem besides their material well-being was the fact that there were fraudulent pastors out there, not enough clergy. And so some people who weren't clergy at all would take advantage of that situation and pretend to be clergy. Probably his best story, at least I think is the greatest one, it talks about a guy, a cooper, a guy who made barrels. And this man drove into a little settlement, and there, because of the kind of cart that he was in, people mistook him for being a preacher. And so he gives it maybe two thoughts, and he says, well, maybe he can make a living as a preacher. And so on Sunday, he conducts a service and preaches, and he does this for about 6 weeks. And then the rumor starts getting around that he is a wife beater. And it was terrible. So they ended up chasing him out of town. And when Wyneken showed up then, some weeks later, they're very suspicious of him. And he asks, well, what's the story here? And they told him the story. And he asked, well, why did you ever accept somebody like that as your preacher? And they said, well, we needed a preacher. He had the gift of gab. And besides, he was cheap. So, yeah, crazy. So anyway, that was the kind of situation that Wyneken would face, as well as people who just were no longer interested in religion. And he would try to encourage them, and they wouldn't come. Wyneken was the type who spoke frankly. And so, for example, there was one fellow who asked him what it was that he was preaching, and he told him briefly, and he said, do you believe that? And Wyneken said, well, of course I believe it. And he says, well, I don't. I think it's nonsense. And so Wyneken says, well, you can keep saying it's nonsense. Just tell that to the devil as he's dragging you down to hell. I don't believe this. I don't believe this. See what happens. So that was the kind of stuff that Wyneken had to do in order to get people's attention and interested once again in their spiritual well-being as well as their material well-being.
Yeah. We have so much more to talk about the Reverend Friedrich Wyneken and our LCMS history. We have to take a quick break, though. We're talking with Dr. Cameron MacKenzie from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
You're a miracle. You know that, right? A living, breathing, one-of-a-kind miracle. You were created to stand apart, to share your gifts in the service of others, to make an uncommon impact in a common world. And at Concordia University, it's our mission to help you do that, to live uncommon. To learn more about Concordia, go to cuw.edu.
You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
We're talking with Dr. Cameron MacKenzie from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, about the life of Reverend Friedrich Wyneken and our early LCMS history. And before we went to break, you were talking about some of the struggles, the difficulties that Wyneken had to deal with as he came from Germany and was a missionary pastor around the new Midwest states, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. Who are some of the people that he did work with, the network of other Germans that he was working with to actually plant some of these churches?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because in addition to remembering him as a missionary pastor, we also have to give God thanks for the work that Wyneken did to publicize the need for the Germans here in North America. And he did this primarily by sending reports back to the motherland to fellow Lutherans who, like him, were concerned about reaching people with the gospel. And they had organized things like mission societies in which they would pray, collect money, try to recruit men for the mission field. And so he would write reports back. And these reports were very well written and very moving. And there were a number of men who ended up becoming important in terms of the founding of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, who actually read his reports and were at least in part moved by that. One was August Kramer, who became the great missionary to the Indians in Frankenmuth in Michigan. Another was Wilhelm Thieler, who became the first vice president of the Missouri Synod and longtime pastor here in Fort Wayne, helped to found my seminary, Concordia Theological Seminary. And another, a man who did not come to America, but recruited, trained, and sent about 80 other missionaries, was Wilhelm Lea. And he was a pastor in Franconia, Neuendettelsau, not too far from Nuremberg. And he read some of Wyneken's very early materials, reworked them for an article in a church paper. And in response to that article, a man showed up at his parsonage and said, I'm ready to go. And so Wyneken and the fellow pastor trained him, and there was another fellow who turned up, and they trained him, and they sent two men to America in 1842. But the reason they were doing that is they'd been moved to do that by Wyneken's reports back. Now, in 1841, Wyneken himself returned to Germany. He had some health issues, but those health issues did not prevent him from kind of going on a lecture tour. And so he met some of these men and recruited and inspired others. And one of those whom he inspired personally was a fellow by the name of Friedrich Lochner. And Lochner was one of the early pastors in Milwaukee. He also taught for a while at this seminary, and he was actually one of the first in the Missouri Synod to be interested in liturgics. But yeah, a very important guy. And again, it was Wyneken who inspired him. Wyneken inspired him directly, and Wyneken was a powerful speaker. And Lochner recorded how, when Wyneken was talking about the challenges of frontier ministry and the Methodist preachers who preached emotional experience, revival experiences, Wyneken shifted into kind of a Methodist mode, and he went down to the front row and he said, "Do you want to be saved?" And Lochner said they thought they were in a Methodist revival all of a sudden. So he was very effective in personal communications as well as through his writings. And a lot of those writings have been translated into English, and they are available if you go to a library or something. So.
You mentioned earlier that there was a shortage of clergy and the importance of having faithful clergy. What was Wyneken's influence on theological education in our church body, in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod?
Yeah, that's a good question. Wyneken was pastor, like home base was Fort Wayne, and another place outside of Fort Wayne is Friedheim, and that was kind of home base for him, those two churches. But there were men that he saw as possible preachers, and so he recruited them for the ministry. One of those, I just mentioned this briefly, his name was Fricke. And Fricke was a kind of a rationalist, critic of Christianity. And he told Wyneken, "Well, I don't believe what you're saying." So Wyneken said, "Well, I'm glad you're honest. Let's talk about this." And over a period of weeks, he did talk and answered his questions. And Fricke ended up becoming a Christian, a Lutheran. And then Wyneken recruited him for the ministry, but there wasn't a seminary close at hand he could send him to. So he trained Fricke and Hussmann and Jepker in his parsonage. He trained them for the ministry. And that was a fairly typical way that they did on the frontier. It's kind of an apprenticeship program. Well, when Wyneken took a call to Baltimore, his successor here in Fort Wayne was Wilhelm Seeler, and Seeler picked up the pieces with instructing those men that Wyneken had started, and then it was Seeler who a few years later ended up establishing Concordia Theological Seminary here in Fort Wayne, and that was in 1846. So you can kind of think of Wyneken as a maybe grandfather or godfather to Concordia Seminary. But, and I really should stress this, what they were doing is they were really training men who could preach the gospel here on the frontier. And they weren't super concerned with a deep academic education of the sort that you could get back in Germany, but rather equipping them to deal with the work that was right there in front of them, as the Germans continued to come in ever larger numbers through those decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like you mentioned, that work of being a pastor in mid 1800s America was definitely not a job for the weary or the faint of heart. It was a difficult thing to be a pastor to all those immigrants in an area where there wasn't a lot of resources available. Before we run out of time, I want to get into the history of the beginning of the LCMS. Well, how did Wyneken help shape the founding of our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod?
Well, Wyneken and those other men that I mentioned all came to America with the idea that they would affiliate with the Lutheran churches that were already in existence here. And Wyneken, in particular, joined a group here in Fort Wayne called the Synod of the West. And that, in turn, was a part of a much larger group called the General Synod. Well, what Wyneken discovered about the General Synod is they weren't really very Lutheran. Their leading theologian was a man by the name of Samuel Simon Schmucker. And Schmucker actually did something that most of the others didn't do. He published works on theology. But in those works on theology, when he dealt with the Lord's Supper, for example, he said, well, here in America, Lutherans, some believe it's just a representation of Christ's body. Others believe in the real presence and so forth. And then he said, and we don't fight about this. You can kind of take your choice. We have adherents of all positions. And Schmucker himself, professor at Gettysburg Seminary, leader in the General Synod, he was closer to Zwingli than he was to Luther in terms of what he thought the Lord's Supper was all about. A memorial meal, representational, denied the real presence. So Wyneken and these others discovered that the Lutheran church bodies that they had affiliated with were not, after all, very Lutheran. And so it was in the fall of 1845 that Wyneken and Lochner and Seeler met in Cleveland to talk about their affiliation, and they decided, you know what, we're going to have to establish a Lutheran church body that's really Lutheran and that is committed to the doctrine that our Lutheran forefathers confessed on the basis of the scriptures in the Lutheran confessions. And so that decision was made in September. And by that time, they knew about the Saxons, that C.F.W. Walther and his group down in Missouri, because Walther had started to publish Der Lutheraner, the Lutheran. And when Wyneken saw that, his comment was, thank God there are still some Lutherans in America. So they reached out to those folks, and it was the two groups, the Wyneken Lea group in this part of the country and the Saxon group in your part of the country that actually worked together to form the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
So where do we see his legacy today, and why should I tell that in my circle of friends and in my church body too?
Well, the way I like to do it is I like to say that in the forming of the Missouri Synod, there were two ideas that complemented each other very well. The Saxons, the Walther group, they came to America looking for a free country in which they could set up a truly Orthodox Lutheran church. Whereas Wyneken and the laymen, they came to America looking for opportunities to reach people with the gospel who otherwise wouldn't hear it, wouldn't be in church. Those two ideas come together to form the Missouri Synod. We're still committed to biblical Christianity, Lutheran doctrine, but why are we committed to it? Because we want to reach people with God's truth for the salvation of their souls. So both Walther and Wyneken kind of combined to put the Missouri Synod clearly on biblical doctrine and clearly also on a mission path to reach people with that doctrine.
Thanks be to God that we have this church body today because of the work of those men who went out to share the good news of Jesus to those German immigrants and to the Germans that came over to America. We are sadly all out of time. I know there's so much more to this story that we could tell. Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, the Forrest E. and Francis H. Ellis Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thanks so much for being our guest today.
You are very welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@KFUO.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.